said the
yes,
definition of men and women have changed dramatically over the
yes,
100,
yes, yes, yes,
200, 300 years. And I'm sure, as you said quite rightly, it's going to change in the future.
yeah,
So what was the conversation about men and women like 200, 300 years ago? Like what was the definitions put on place to men and women then? And how has it changed to today's world?
sure, sure. So the example that I always think of is a lot of Middle Eastern countries. Today, the imagination is often this idea that they are incredibly patriarchal and they've always been backwards countries
Yeah.
that beat women X, Y, Z, right?
Yeah.
Um, Again, with notions of men and women or categories of gender, it's not only time specific but location specific as well.
Okay.
So if you look, one of the essential books for this is called "Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards." It's a book by theorist and historian Afsan Najm, who talks about the shift of gender relations post modernity, and how during a particular time period, women with hair on the upper lip were considered the most beautiful. And a lot of those pictures of the princesses of those times, when you look at them today, you'd think they were big fat blokes. You would not think that they were, our conceptions of beauty
Mm.
today, for example. And in that particular time period, relationships between men, like if a lot of the poetry written was love poetry between men. It was men talking about, oh, I would die for your eyelash, and a lot of very romantic conceptions of the way that men relate to one another nowadays. And you can still see this effect in a lot of Middle Eastern children. If they ask their parents for pictures, often they'll see their fathers and their friends holding pinkies together,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's
yeah.
seen as the most normal thing. That there's no perception of it. And the hypothesis is that once industrialization and once modernity began to come to fruition, uh, there was a lot of government policies to enforce something like monogamous marriage, for example,
Mm.
to enforce and restrict sexuality based on a mode of production. And that the shift that occurred is, remember, power is always trying to naturalize itself.
Mm.
Anyone who's in power, whether it's the Pope, whether it's the king of old, or whether it's banks today, always express the fact that without their existence, without the forces that benefit them, everything would collapse.
Mm.
And that this is the natural one. Once upon a time it was God, today it's capital. As long if they collapse, the whole thing, the whole show is over, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in the same way, this idea was propagated that if you do not have monogamous heterosexual marriages, society would collapse. And that's why the figure of the uh, 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 you know the non-heterosexual in a lot of Middle Eastern literature is a very problematic one. People ignore it. Like people will be reading poetry about relations between men, and they'll truly convince themselves that they're talking about God. That is just a metaphor about God. That is just because of the education of heteronormativity as natural, that has been propagated, that the rest of the ideas suddenly shift in favor of that particular mindset that the person has, essentially.
That's so interesting. That is so
Yeah,
interesting. So
yeah.
where does
I was mind blown when I read this. It was definitely a shock to the system.
so just a question. You said that so it was normal for men and men to write poetry together, to hold hands together. It was normal. It was just a part of society at that time. And then because
Yeah.
of industrialization, we needed heterosexual marriages to have steady families so then the men could work. Is that what you were trying to get to?
Well,
Or
but also one has to understand that the pressure to modernize, or the pressure to industrialize, was not, no villager in a rural village in Iraq decided now's the time to modernize. These are forces of parliament, the idea of evolution, of parliamentary democracy, that things need to be pushed in a certain way and replicated as a result. And in a lot of states, you can see the slow replication, where clothing starts to become suit and tie instead of being, the traditional garb and traditional wear. Music starts to change. Language starts to change. People begin to adopt various forms of writing, forms of speech, and so a whole history is completely changed and shifted based on an ideal, or an idealism of how one should be, how one should progress. It sounds strange, but if we think about the phenomena of skin bleaching, blonding one's hair, putting in colored eye contacts, or having nose jobs, having surgery to fit to look a particular way, these things seem not normal, but things that happen in day-to-day life. But it seems very strange for us to think how people would shift their sexual appetites, or how they even self-identify as a result of these shifting trends. I mean, even if we look into Hollywood, for example, what was considered beautiful in the 80s is very different to what's considered beautiful now, or
100%.
sexual.
Yeah,
what's
definitely.
considered sexy change, and it's such a dramatic shift. It's such a big shift between types of bodies, and it's always a question of how do these shifts happen? Who do they benefit? Who do they exclude? And what's the power relation behind them?